Back in 1986, in the quiet little town of Pill, Massachusetts, the Johnson family moved into a creaky, old colonial house that had clearly seen better days. Mark Johnson was raising his two daughters alone after tragically losing their mother. Emily was 16, and her younger sister, Lily, was only 9, making them a close-knit family trying to find their footing after the loss. Not long after they settled in, strange and unsettling things started happening around the house. It all began with minor oddities tapping sounds inside the walls, lights flickering and flickering at random, and furniture occasionally shifting slightly out of place. They thought it was just the quirks of living in an old place and brushed it off. But things soon started to get worse. One night, Emily and Lily decided to play with a Ouija board for fun, giggling at first, but their amusement quickly turned to terror when the board began to respond on its own. Moments later, they distinctly heard 3 sharp knocks coming from inside the wall, causing their hearts to race. That's when fear really started to settle in. As days went by, more bizarre things happened. Objects disappeared without explanation. The TV would turn on by itself late at night, and Mark began to feel like he was being watched. Nothing, however, could have prepared them for what would happen next. One evening, Mark returned home to utter chaos. The house was inexplicably ice cold despite the central heating being on. Static blared from radios, and the TV was on but with no signal. As he climbed the staircase, he froze in horror when he saw something truly unsettling at the end of the hall, a teenage boy he didn't recognize, standing there. The boy was wearing a wig and a wedding dress, his face smeared with makeup, clutching a hatchet. It was later identified as David Carlson, a man who had been living secretly inside the walls of the Johnson house for months. David had broken in long ago, driven by an unhealthy obsession with Emily. He had installed peepholes to spy on her and her family, sneaking around in the crawl spaces like a rat, only coming out when no one was around. The noises, the missing items, and the creeping feeling of being watched, all of it was him. Mark managed to grab his daughters and flee, alerting the police immediately. When authorities searched the house, they discovered David hiding in a tiny, hidden wall cavity, crouched silently. Behind the walls, they found tunnels with blankets, snack wrappers, and peepholes. David was arrested, but later released on bail. Not long afterward, he broke into a neighboring house and murdered a pregnant woman and her 2 children in an unspeakable act. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. The Johnsons refused to go back to that house, and the place remained vacant. Across the country, near Ohio State University, in 2013, a group of college students rented a dilapidated house off campus, sharing it among 10 of them. It was cheap, prone to quirks like flickering lights and strange noises, but they shrugged it off at first. That was until Brett, one of the tenants, began noticing odd behavior. Cabinet doors left ajar, their fridge mysteriously emptier, and lights turning on without anyone recalling switching them on. The basement door was always locked, with a label reading utility closet, which seemed odd but unthreatening at first. Then one night, Brett went down to reset the breaker after a power surge. As he turned the corner in the dark basement, he saw a barefoot man walking out. The man looked completely at ease, as if he belonged there. Stunned, Brett froze and asked, "Who are you?" The man, who introduced himself as Jeremy, simply walked away, leaving Brett more confused than ever. The roommates forced their way into the locked basement room and made a shocking discovery. A small makeshift living space filled with a mattress, personal photos, books, and a guitar. Jeremy had been living undetected in the basement for weeks, maybe even longer, quietly eating their food, using their bathroom, and sneaking around without anyone noticing. Jeremy had a copy of the house key, left over from a previous tenant, and had simply moved in after everyone thought he had left. The police were called, and Jeremy was taken into custody without resistance. He had no ID, no explanation, just appeared to be a homeless drifter. Police believe he had been watching them long before they ever discovered him. After that, No one felt secure in the house anymore. Not long after Jeremy was gone, another group of students moved in, dismissing the warnings as urban legends. But soon enough, they began experiencing the same unsettling phenomena: missing food, footsteps echoing at night, doors mysteriously ajar. One curious roommate even ventured into the basement again and made a disturbing discovery. Another man, older this time, secretly living there. His name was Eric. Like Jeremy, he had managed to slip in with a copied key, and though he was polite and unthreatening, his presence caused paranoia to skyrocket among the students. He apologized and offered to leave, but knowing someone had been sleeping inches beneath them, watching and listening, left everyone paranoid and frightened. The house's reputation never recovered. They started locking every door, installing security cameras, and steering clear of the basement entirely. They learned a term for this phenomenon: frauding, when someone secretly lives inside another's home without their knowledge. For these students, it wasn't just a creepy story. It was terrifyingly real and forever changed how they experienced their living space. In Spokane, Washington, a woman named Ashley moved into a small one-bedroom house near the woods outside the city last winter, after breaking up with a guy who had a long history of erratic behavior and jail time. The house was old but charming, sitting on a quiet street, just enough space for her and her dog. She loved the peace at first, even though the house occasionally creaked and the pipes groaned. But after a couple of months, strange things started happening. It began at night, when Ashley was lying in bed. She'd hear faint, muffled breathing, like someone with a heavy cold exhaling slowly through their nose. And the sound always came from the same wall beside her bed. She even moved her nightstand to see if perhaps it was a vent or some mechanical noise. But there was nothing, just an old, faded wall with a little, sealed-off square panel near the baseboard. She dismissed it as an old utility hatch and tried to ignore the strange noises. But then the other sounds started. Late at night, around 2 to 4 a.m., she'd hear quiet tapping, almost like fingers gently rapping on wood. One night, she awoke to what she thought was a whispering sound emanating from inside the wall, though she couldn't make out the words. That was the moment she decided to leave the house in fear and stayed at her friend's place instead. When explaining the noises, her friend joked about a possible haunting, but Ashley knew she wasn't imagining it. It felt far too real. Gradually, she started sleeping on the living room couch just to avoid her bedroom. Yet even there, she thought she could hear faint sounds like someone crawling through insulation or moving around within the walls. After almost a week of avoiding her room, she finally decided to investigate that tiny square panel on the wall with a crowbar. To her surprise, it came off much easier than she expected. The screws weren't even securing it. Behind the panel was a dark cavity. She flipped on her phone's flashlight and peeked inside. At first, she saw insulation and old wood, but then she realized the space opened into a larger crawl area, about 3 feet wide, stretching back into complete darkness. As she leaned closer, she saw a figure in the far corner, a man sitting with his knees pulled to his chest. His skin was pale, filthy, and his eyes were wide and fixed on hers. He didn't move or speak. He just stared, dead silent, as if waiting for her. She screamed, fumbling and dropping her phone, then ran out of the house. When police arrived, they searched the crawl space and found he was gone. Inside, they pulled out evidence: the remains of a makeshift campsite with a sleeping bag, plastic bottles filled with urine, wrappers, and dozens of sketches, drawn onto the walls and insulation with pencil and charcoal. Most of the drawings depicted a woman, likely Ashley herself. The man had entered through a forgotten storage hatch in the basement utility closet that led behind the walls of her bedroom, directly to the crawl space. It appeared he'd been watching her and listening to her sleep for weeks before she even discovered him. He had no ID and no clear motive, just a homeless man who had been living inside the walls, possibly even before she moved in. The police believed he had been there in secret long before she caught him. Ashley moved out immediately, too shaken to stay. Her landlord tried to patch the walls and make the house look new again, but no one dared rent it afterward. The idea that someone had been living so close, hidden in the dark, just inches away from her, haunted her for a long time. Later, neighbors told her that a young couple had moved into the house a few months after her departure, but left in less than a month for no clear reason. The house sat empty now, a ghost of its former self. And then there's the story of Ted Conley in Denver, Colorado, back in 1941. Philip Harding was a 73-year-old retired railroader living alone while his wife was hospitalized. Old and cautious, Philip kept to his routines, living in a charming Victorian home with sharply peaked eaves and an attic space that most would see as uninhabitable. He knew every creak, every flicker of shadow except, unbeknownst to him, someone else was learning those secrets too. A man named Walter Conklin in his early 60s once knew Philip socially. He was desperate, homeless, and unwell. One day, he decided to enter Philip's house uninvited, finding the attic's crawl space barely large enough for a grown man. Conklin chose to live there undetected. He crept around only when Philip was away, stealing food, water, and newspapers. He left behind faint footsteps, creaks, and odd noises which Philip chalked up to the house's age. But one night, Philip came home early from a hospital visit, and he heard movement upstairs. Climbing the stairs, he was shocked to find Conklin emerging from the attic hatch. Conklin attacked him with a rusty shovel, beating him to death and hiding again in the dark. The police, baffled, found no signs of forced entry or valuables, missing just the bloody crime scene and an eerily silent house. Months passed with no leads and the case went cold. Meanwhile, Conklin remained inside the attic, living above the scene of his crime. Neighbors started noticing odd signs of movement and disrupted dust in the abandoned house. When authorities checked again, they found Conklin hiding in a cramped, dark crawl space behind the drywall, in a secret tunnel he'd cut himself. He had set up a tiny camp with food, water, and clothing, living there for over a month after the murder. He'd made a peephole in the wall, giving him a perfect view into Philip's bedroom, and had been watching him sleep. When police finally found him, he was emaciated, filthy, and appeared completely unhinged. He admitted to living there in secret for weeks, living off his hidden supplies. The media dubbed him the Denver Spider-Man, and he was sentenced to life in prison. That house was never used again. Then there's the story from South Carolina, 2012. A woman named Linda was living with her 5 kids when she started noticing strange things. She'd recently left her volatile, jail-prone ex, but the house, an old one near the woods, seemed normal enough until things got weird. Nails from the ceiling would start pushing downward, as if someone was trying to yank them out. She'd hear scratching and faint thumping, along with whispering, and initially thought stress was playing tricks on her mind. But as days went by, objects would move slightly, food would disappear faster than it should, and one morning she woke up to find bits of insulation and debris scattered on her bed. Frightened, she sent her nephew to check the attic. What he found chilled them both. Her ex had been secretly living up there. He'd carved out a tiny space next to the heating system, made a bed from blankets and coats, and had been spying on her through a vent directly above her bed. They found plastic cups filled with urine and feces, showing he had been staying there for over 2 weeks without leaving. He ultimately admitted he had been living in the attic for more than 2 weeks and left peacefully when confronted, but the trauma lingered. She said she'd be haunted, shaken for life. Fast forward to February 2020, in Oklahoma City, a man named Mike began noticing small anomalies in his house: the cereal box half empty when it should be full, the back door unlocked one morning, and the thermostat mysteriously changed overnight. He thought it might be a prank or maybe an animal messing around. But when he finally checked the attic after persistent strange noises, his flashlight revealed a horrifying sight. A middle-aged man asleep on a mattress, surrounded by clothes and trash. The intruder was unkempt, exhausted, and looked like he hadn't left his hiding spot in days. Mike quickly called the police. holding him at gunpoint until they arrived, discovering he had entered through an unused rear attic door and had been living undetected for nearly a week. He had no connection to Mike, only survival-driven desperation. He was arrested for unlawful entry, and Mike said the experience changed him forever, could no longer trust his own home, knowing someone had been living so close, hidden in the darkness, right underneath him. Meanwhile, Lisa, a woman in Portland, Oregon, bought a small house outside town earlier this year after her breakup. It was an old place but charming, quiet, and perfect for her and her dog. At first, she loved her new home, but after a couple of months, she started noticing strange signs: soft, muffled breathing near her wall, like someone with a cold exhaling slowly into their hand, coming from just behind her bed. She even moved her nightstand to check if some vent or mechanical source was responsible. But there was nothing, just an old wall with a sealed panel bolted shut near the baseboard. Late at night, between 2 and 4 a.m., she began hearing tiny taps, like fingers rapping on wood, and then, one night, a faint whisper emanating from within the wall. She started sleeping on the couch and kept hearing faint sound scuffling, maybe someone crawling through insulation. After a week, she finally decided to investigate that little panel. It came off with ease, her screws weren't even tight. Behind it, she found a dark, hidden crawl space about 3 feet wide. She shined her phone's light inside and saw insulation, old boards, and to her horror a man sitting cross-legged in the corner. Pale, filthy, eyes wide and fixed on her. He didn't move or speak, just stared like he'd been waiting for her. She screamed, dropped her phone, and ran out. The police found him gone when they searched the crawl space, but they uncovered evidence he had lived there for weeks: a sleeping bag, plastic bottles filled with urine, wrappers, and hundreds of sketches drawn all over the wood and insulation, mainly of her. The man had entered through a forgotten hatch behind her bedroom closet, which led directly into the crawl space, and had been watching her sleep. They had no idea who he was or where he came from. He offered no explanation. He was likely homeless, or maybe worse, a predator who had picked her house at random and stayed hidden. Unable to stay there, she moved out immediately, traumatized by the thought of someone living so close, just inches away in the dark in her own home. And of course, there's the story from Denver, 1941. Philip Peterson was a retired railroad worker living alone while his wife was in hospital. An upright and courteous man, he kept routines strictly, unaware that someone else was learning everything about his house, including its shadows and creaks, and that this person was living right above his head. Walter Conrad, a man in his early 60s, was once a friend of Philip's, but now he was homeless and desperate. One day, out of sheer desperation, Conrad broke into Philip's Victorian home. Finding the attic with its tiny crawl space, he decided to hide there, living in the shadows for weeks, stealing food and newspapers whenever Philip was gone. Hidden behind the walls, he left faint footprints and odd creaks. That was until one day Philip came home early. Hearing movement upstairs, he climbed the stairs only to be attacked by Conrad. The intruder, wielding a rusty shovel, struck him down and fled into the attic again. No signs of forced entry, no valuables stolen, just a brutal murder in an otherwise quiet house. The case went cold, and for months, Conrad lived in the attic, hidden, silent, unnoticed, until neighbors started noticing strange signs of movement. When police checked the house again, they found Conrad living in a concealed tunnel behind a loose drywall panel, with a small camp set up, clothes, food, water, living there over a month after the crime. He watched Philip's house through a small peephole he cut in the drywall, letting him observe his victims sleep every night. He was finally caught after police found him emaciated and unhinged, living inside the walls. Dubbed the Denver Spider-Man, he got life in prison. And of course, there's the South Carolina case in 2012. A woman named Sarah had 5 children and was trying to rebuild her life after a bad breakup. She soon began noticing strange things above her and the ceiling seeming to be pulled downward, scratching sounds, faint whispering. She initially thought it was her stress making her imagine things, but then objects moved, food disappeared, and debris was seen on her bed one morning. Her nephew investigated and discovered her ex had carved out a tiny space beside the heating unit in the attic living there, with a bed made from blankets, spying on her through a vent directly above her sleeping area. He admitted he'd been hiding up there for over 2 weeks, surviving on his own while she slept just a few feet below. She was devastated, stating she'd be haunted and shaken forever. Fast forward to 2020 in Oklahoma City, where a man named Kevin noticed strange disturbances in cereal, an unlocked back door, unexplained temperature changes. When he finally checked the attic, he found a man sleeping on a mattress amid a pile of clothes. The intruder, unkempt and exhausted, had entered through a rear attic door and been living there for nearly a week without detection. The police arrested him, and Kevin said that day changed his view of his house forever, knowing someone had been hiding so close beneath him, completely unseen. Finally, in Portland, Oregon, Lisa moved into a small 1950s house after breaking up with her boyfriend. She adored her quiet home until about 2 months in when she started noticing mysterious sounds, breathing, tapping, whispering from within the wall beside her bed. She even moved her nightstand to check if mechanical noise was the cause, but found only an old, sealed panel. Later, she discovered a hidden crawl space behind that panel, and when she finally looked in, she saw a man sitting cross-legged in the corner, staring silently, waiting for her. She screamed, ran out, and called the police. They found him gone when they searched the crawl space, but evidence suggested he had lived there for weeks. Sketches of her, a hidden camp, and a peephole he'd made through the wall, watching her sleep. The police suspected he was a homeless drifter or perhaps a predator who had been living right there, unseen in her own home just inches away. She left immediately, traumatized, not trusting her house anymore, haunted by what lurked in the dark, just beyond her sight.